Hi Algebra 1, welcome back to class. Today we will be starting a new week in Algebra 1. We will be picking up where we left off last week. We started last Friday with using our x forms as a shortcut to factoring quadratics. Remember that quadratics are polynomials at the highest power, or the degree is 2x squared. And we were factoring quadratics that had a lead coefficient of 1, so they weren't really hard. We used our x form though as a shortcut method to think through the backwards operation through the FOIL method. Well, today we're going to use the x form as I teach you a shortcut for more difficult quadratics. Today we will be working with polynomials that have a lead coefficient other than 1. So as you can see, if you remember in our videos last week, we talked about the standard form of a quadratic, where we have ax squared plus bx plus c. And I'm going to label them over here today because it's going to be helpful as we move along. So last week, we worked with lead coefficients of 1, which meant that a was 1. Well, as you can see in today's problem, my a is 3, so that complicates things a little bit. And I want to demonstrate to you, just take a couple minutes to show you why that makes factoring a little bit more difficult. So I know that if I have these 3 terms, that I'm going to end up with 2 binomials being multiplied together. And then I know from last week that I know my first term is going to be x and x. That's the only way to multiply 2 things together to get x squared in this case. But if I throw in this concept of a lead coefficient other than 1, that means, at least in this case, it's a prime number. So I know my only options are 3x and 1x. But because there are 2 different positions, it opens up the possibility that it's this setup. Well, that's not even taking into account my last term being negative 15. In the FOIL, the L is my last, so I know my 2 numbers, my 2 lasts, have to multiply together to get me negative 15. Well, I know that could be negative 15 and 1, or it could be 1 and negative 15 in this order. Or it could be negative 1 and positive 15. I just listed 4 different possibilities there. Not even taking into account that, wait a minute, we have some other factors. 5 and negative 3, negative 3 and 5 if I'm switching them around, or even negative 5 and positive 3. So you can see there's so many different possibilities here. And without using a shortcut method, I would have to use trial and error. Well, I'm going to show you today that we don't have to use trial and error. We don't have to go through all these different methods. So I'm going to erase my thinking process, and I actually forgot to bring my eraser with me. So let me grab that. And we're going to scrap this whole part right here. And I'm going to show you how x forms are really, really helpful when we are factoring these types of quadratics. Now, I want to point out to you that if you look in your book in chapter 8, section 6, which is where we are today, and that is on page 506 in your book, and you will want to follow along. I want to point out to you that the book does not demonstrate the shortcut method that I'm going to teach you today. It uses all of the same mathematical and algebraic thinking, but it is not going to be this method. So if you are stumped on this, I want you just to rewatch my video. My note handout today is especially helpful. I'll show you mine. I changed the orientation so that I could list for you the steps specifically and precisely in this shortcut method. And I did it horizontally so that you can use those steps as we go through the other 2 examples we're going to go through after this one. And then you can even use those steps and do your practice problems step by step. So I do recommend that you look and open up the document of my note handout for today's lesson You don't need to print it out if you don't want to. Obviously, you can take the notes on regular paper and pencil. But I highly, highly recommend taking notes. Okay, we're still going to use our X form today, but our method is going to be called divide and slide, and you're going to see that as we go through. So step 1, and in the note handout, I have these written out for you, but I'm going to go very slowly and very particularly mention these steps. So step 1, remember A, B, and C. A is my number in front of my squared variable term. B is my number in front of my regular variable term. And C is my number. Remember, I take my signs with it. So this one would be C is negative 15, B is positive 4, and A is 3. We used our X form and we would put C in our ceiling. If you remember that from last week, C goes in the ceiling. However, now that we have an A other than 1, I want you to know that our AC goes in the ceiling. AC. And the way I'm writing that is showing you that it's multiplication. A times C goes in my ceiling. So in this case, A times C is negative 45. I don't just take the last number now. I do A times C. That's step 1. Step 2, my B term still goes in the basement. Again, referencing last week's video. My B still goes in my basement. So that means my B is 4. Okay, now I need to solve my X form as step 3, as usual. That means I need 2 numbers that multiply together to get me negative 45, but add together to get me 1. Well, as you can imagine, as soon as I have an A other than 1, I'm going to have a lot more factors possible. So I'm going to be needing to be quick on listing my factors, and a calculator may come in handy. So if I talk about the factors of 45, there's a few of them. Let's see, we have 45 and 1. We have 15 and 3. We've got 9 and 5. Okay, I can stop there because if I look at 9 and 5, somehow I'm going to get 4. Remembering that if this is negative, if this term is negative, one of these is going to be positive and one is going to be negative. So if I fill in my X form as this, 9 and negative 5, that completes this pattern correctly. 9 times negative 5 gives me negative 45, but 9 plus negative 5 gives me 4. So this is my completed X form. Well, what do we do with that? Our next step, in step 4, I'm going to use these 2 sides to write my binomials, just like I did on Friday. But the key here is I'm not done. So I'm going to write my binomials as x plus 9 and x minus 5. Well, I have this lead coefficient of 3. My A is 3. So this is where the term divide and slide comes into play. So step 5 tells me that I'm going to divide my second terms by my A, or by my 3. And in step 6, I need to simplify this and reduce it. X plus 9 over 3. Well, 9 over 3 is 9 divided by 3, and that divides evenly to this. However, look at my next one. I have 5/3. I can't simplify that into a whole number. It doesn't divide evenly. 5 divided by 3 is 5/3. I also can't reduce it. So what I do is I slide it. This is where the term slide comes in. This denominator, I'm going to slide it to be in front of my coefficient, or excuse me, in front of my variable. It becomes my coefficient. So in the case of a fraction that cannot be reduced or simplified into a whole number, that denominator slides to in front of my variable. Divide and slide. So my answer to this problem is x plus 3 times the quantity 3x minus 5. Now, if I had gone back to the beginning of this video and worked through all the different combinations to get me 3 and 1, all of my different factors of 15, rearranging them in order, switching them in the parentheses, some are positive, some are negative, I would have still gotten this answer eventually. So it would have taken a lot of headache. So this is a very helpful shortcut called divide and slide. We still use our x form, but then we use our lead coefficient to divide and then slide. Okay, on the note handout, you'll see number 7 says FOIL to check. That's how I check all of my factoring answers. I'm gonna go ahead through and FOIL this and make sure that what I get here is what I started with in this problem. So my firsts give me 3x squared. My outsides, negative 5x. My insides, positive 9x. And my last, negative 15. First, outside, inside, last. I see that these two are common terms because they have the same variable and power. So I would add them, and then I can see, okay, what I'm ending up with during my check process is what I started with in the first place. So this is the correct factored form of my quadratic here. Okay. I hope that you went through and wrote down steps 1 through 7. How about I repeat them? Step 1, we put AC, A times C in the ceiling. Step 2, B, my B term goes in my basement. Step 3, I solve my X form as usual. Now I should be feeling very comfortable with this pattern at this point. Step 4, use these two sides to translate to my two binomials, taking my signs with it. X plus 9 times x minus 5. Step 5 is divide. I take that A and I divide my number by A, divided by A. Then I'm going to reduce and simplify as possible here. 9 divided by 3 gives me 3. That means this binomial is done. This one is reduced as far as it can go, but if I still have a denominator, I slide that to my lead coefficient, 3x minus 5. And then step 7, FOIL to check. Okay, we're going to do this 2 more times together. I hope as we go through, you're going to feel very comfortable, and then we'll do some practice problems where I'm going to ask you to solve them using this divide and slide method. Okay, you can see in your book and in the note handout that problem number 2 is this. 5x squared plus 11x plus 2. Again, I just want to go through and show you my A, my B, and my C. And going through, I'm going to go a little bit more quickly this time, going through the steps. Step 1, my A times my C goes in my ceiling. A times C is 10 in this problem. Step 2, my B still goes in the basement. Step 3, I'm going to solve for the sides as usual. 2 numbers that multiply to get me 10, but add to get me 11. This one's kind of nice to us. I see it's 10 and 1. That X form is complete following our pattern. Now our next step, step number 4, I'm going to use these sides to write my binomials. X plus 10 times x plus 1. And this is where the name comes into play, divide and slide. I'm going to divide my second terms in the position in my binomial by my lead coefficient, my A. So I have 10 divided by 5 and 1 divided by 5. This is where I reduce and simplify as possible. Well, in this first binomial, x plus 10 over 5, that equals x plus 2. In my second one, it is reduced and simplified as far as it can go. And if I still have a denominator, this is where the slide comes in. I pull that out front. And there's my factored form of my second problem. Of course, my last step is to FOIL it, and see that I end up where I started. So my firsts would give me 5x squared. So far, so good. Outsides, 1x plus 10x gives me 11x. And my last would be 2. So you can see that the checking process does not need to be written down. You could be getting good enough and as comfortable enough with the FOIL method to be able to just do this in your head. Okay, let's move on to number 3. Again, I'm going to go pretty quickly, but I still call out the steps, and we'll solve this one together. Okay, problem number 3 looks like this. 2x squared minus 13x, it's minus 7. These are coming straight from your book that you can follow along and see the answers. But again, as I mentioned, the book doesn't necessarily use this shortcut method. I think this one is a lot easier, but you'll notice if you do look at the examples in the book, it's using the same concepts, working backwards through the FOIL method. Okay, here is my quadratic. I have a lead coefficient other than 1, so that means my first step is going to be write my x form. And A times C goes into my ceiling. B goes into my basement. And then I solve it. Two numbers that multiply together to get me negative 14. Some combination of 14 and 1. But I know that one of them has to be negative. This one is it, because negative 14 plus 1 gives me negative 13. So my next step is to take my sides and write my 2 binomials. This is where the name of this shortcut method comes in. Next step, divide. There's my A. Divide this by my A and this by my A. Those fractions that I have left, I reduce and simplify as far as I can go. So this first one becomes x minus 7. My second binomial, however, is reduced as far as it can go, but that means I still have a denominator that slides to the front. So my factored form of this quadratic is x minus 7 times 2x plus 1. Don't forget that last step of checking. 2x squared plus 1x minus 14x gives me negative 13x minus 7. And so I ended up right back where I started. Okay, now is the time that you are going to pause the video and practice problems. However, if you're not following along with my note handout, let me take a second and write our 2 problems on the actual whiteboard for you, because they're taken from a few different problems in this section in 8-6. So the first one gives you a quadratic to factor. The second one is based on a geometry problem where I'm going to give you the area of a rectangle I want to know the length and the width. And let me tell you where you'll find that in your book if you're following along. That is problem number 3, talking about the area of a rectangle. So I want you to try these 2 practice problems. Use your steps for divide and slide. Pause the video, go do that, and then restart it when you're ready to go over the answers. Okay, if you've tried these 2 on your own, the first one is a simple problem like we've just done, where I give you the quadratic and you have to solve it using the divide and slide method, which would use my x form and my divide and slide method. So I'm going to quickly go through that. A times C, and my B goes in the basement. My sides are 10 and 3, x plus 10, x plus 3, divide by the 6. I need to reduce both of these fractions, and if I do that, what do I get here? I know my writing is getting a little bit smaller, realizing I have a good bit to fit in here. Once they're reduced, if I still have a denominator, I slide that. Divide and slide. So if I do this problem, I would get 3x plus 5 times 2x plus 1. Squeezed that in. Okay, I want to talk about the number 2 practice problem. Again, as I was telling you before you pause the video, this is a geometry-based factoring problem. If I know that the area of a rectangle is this, the question is asking me, what's the length and the width? What are the dimensions of that rectangle? Well, I have to think backwards through this. If I'm told the area, I know that I get area by multiplying length times width. Well, for these problems, when I factor them, factor my quadratics, I'm getting 2 factors, a length and a width. So this problem is just a geometry way of asking you to factor the problem. So I'm going to go ahead and do this one. My X form, my A times my C. Ooh, I got some big numbers in this one. That's okay, you have a calculator. And my B goes in my basement. However, one of the easiest ways to factor 120 is 10 and 12. That's nice because that's the one we need. Add to get me 22, multiply to get me 120. So I'm going to go ahead, use my sides to write my binomials. Then I divide by my A. Divided by 8, divided by 8. I need to reduce those as far as they will go. If they end up being a whole number, wonderful. If they don't, that's where the slide comes in. Divide and slide. So my final answer for this problem, my dimensions for this rectangle are 4x plus 5 and 2x plus 3, a possible length times width. Okay. That's the end of this lesson on factoring trinomials or quadratics with a lead coefficient other than 1. It shows you why the X form is so helpful here, and it showed you one shortcut method called divide and slide. You have some suggested book problems listed in your note handout as well as on RenWeb, and you have one Khan Academy assignment for today. Now, the title of the Khan Academy assignment is Factor Quadratics by Grouping. Don't worry about the title. I want you to practice using this divide and slide method. Take your notes with you to your Khan Academy, whether it's on a phone or on your computer, and follow those steps, step by step, to factor your quadratics. I do want to point out something to you. Every Khan Academy assignment that I assign you, I have already completed. I go through it to make sure that every question applies to something that you learned in my video. I did notice that occasionally they will give you a quadratic with a negative first coefficient, a negative A. I want you to power through and try them. I want you to see and experiment how this shortcut method would work with negative lead coefficients. It still does, by the way. It works, but you have to maybe stop and think a little bit more about your negatives. Okay, that's it for today, and tomorrow's lesson is going to be teaching you a different shortcut method for factoring quadratics. Thanks and have a great day.